I'm very, very happy to be in this space, in this virtual space that we're in. My name is Maria Kisumbi. I work with Humanity United. United, we work to advance conditions that transform violent conflict and exploitation into peace. We work in programs of peace building, countering human trafficking and forced labor, with strong support from our policies, communications, and independent journalism. Before into this very interactive session, I thought I could set the stage, set the tone. We're all in this collective space, this virtuous space. I want us to take a moment and reflect on the situation that we are in. So we are in the middle of a pandemic. This pandemic has exposed the inequalities of our societies across the globe and has highlighted both the strengths and shortcomings of global governance. And we all know one thing is that we cannot get through this pandemic alone. So when we are in this situation, you're sitting, you're reflecting, you're considering how philanthropic institutions can better address these issues of equitable, sustainable development, human rights, peace, and security. I think it's very important for us to reflect on the great wise words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. My humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. These words, I hope you're just taking these words in. These words set the stage for this dialogue that we are going to engage with these leading voices on the future of philanthropy and global governance. As Archbishop Tutu reminds us, we need to cross the traditional lines between philanthropy and governance and global governance institutions. We also need to find ways to work together with local communities whose wisdom can shine a light through the complexity of the COVID world. So at this moment, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce you to our amazing visionaries and philanthropic leaders with us today. So I'd like to introduce Marcel Arsenault. Marcel is a co-founder of One Earth Future, as well as the Arsenault Family Foundation and the Secure World Foundation. Through these foundations, Marcel pursues his passion of promoting systems of governance which prevent war. Marcel served as a board member for MARC for 5 years. His achievements have won him numerous awards, including the Conservation Award for his participation in open space projects in Boulder, Colorado, and the distinguished Stephen B. Hart from Colorado Historical Society for restoring the Tabo Residence and the Tabo Grand Hotel in Lakeville. He was also vice chair of EcoCycle Boulder, one of the earliest and largest nonprofit recycling organizations in the United States. As founder of Real Capital Solutions, Marcel oversees a portfolio exceeding 1.5 billion in real estate assets. He has developed numerous presentations to various universities and real estate organizations. He has authored several articles on real estate, including one academic publication, and is a contributing author of How to Build a Real Estate Empire. He has earned a Bachelor of Science degree from McGill University and was working towards a PhD in molecular biology from the University of Colorado when he started his career as an entrepreneur. In your space, welcome so much, Marcel. We're very excited to have you. You are a visionary and leader in philanthropy.
Well, thank you, Maria.
Next with us is Jens. Jens is the former Minister for Democracy, Metropolitan Affairs, Integration, and Gender Equality of Sweden and Secretary General of the Olof Palme International Center. Previous employments have been as desk officer of the International Division of the Ministry of Finance and as a broadcast journalist with public service channels, Sveriges Television and Sveriges Radio. Trained as an economist, he's interested in conflict resolution, inspired by the fate of his mother during World War II that he described in his book, While the Victory Was Celebrated, My Mother's Story. He was previously the chairman of the Anna Lindh Academy. Jens, we are super excited to have you in this panel. You are a visionary and leader within philanthropy. Welcome. Next with us is Sandra Brecker, who was appointed to the Board of Management of the Robert Bosch Stiftung in September 2017. Since joining in 2001, she has been responsible for a wide range of programs, the establishment of the Robert Bosch Academy, the liaison with public and private partners in Berlin, as well as the Foundation's Berlin's office, most recently as Senior Vice President since April 2013. An expert in international relations as well as foreign and security policy, Sandra previously served as Program Director at the Aspen Institute Berlin after an assignment with the American Council on Germany in New York. After studies in Germany, France, and the United States, she obtained her master's at Columbia University in New York. She was a Yale World Fellow in 2008. Sandra is also a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, as well as the Board of Directors and the Executive Committee of the European Endowment for Democracy. She represents the Foundation on the European Foundation Center Governing Council, the Board of the Maastricht Institute for China Studies, and Executive Committee of Stiftung Neue Verantwortung. My German is getting better. Welcome, 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 Sandra. We are super excited to have you. You're visionary in philanthropy. Very excited.
Thank you, Maria.
And last but not least is James Goldstone, who's the Executive Director of the Open Society Justice Initiative, which advances the rule of law and rights protection worldwide through advocacy, litigation, research, and promotion of legal capacity. A leading practitioner of international human rights and criminal law, Goldstone has litigated several groundbreaking cases before the European Court of Human Rights and United Nations treaty bodies, including on issues of counterterrorism, racial discrimination, and torture. Goldstone previously served as coordinator of prosecutors and senior trial attorney in the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC. He was also the legal director of Budapest European Roma Rights Center, Director General for Human Rights of the Mission to Bosnia, of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and prosecutor in the Office of the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, where he focused on organized crime. Goldstone is a graduate of Columbia College and Harvard Law School. He has taught at Columbia Law School, NYU Law School, and Central European University. Welcome, Jim. This is amazing. You are a visionary and a leader within philanthropy. Super excited to have you on this. Welcome.
Thank you, Maria. Great to be here.
Yes. So I feel the audience, I know you're feeling the wealth and the presence of these amazing leaders in this space. So welcome to all of you, our panelists. The format of this conversation is really going to be a dialogue. I'm going to try and make it a dialogue. And then the audience, do not forget, please feel free to fill in within the chat your questions. And then we'll have a session where we'll be able to answer these questions. So we have 3 rounds for this first round. These questions are going to allow each panelist to present their perspectives and specific thoughts on philanthropy in global governance. So my first question to you, Marcel, is philanthropy for global governance has to balance big issues with both a global perspective and a local impact. How have you addressed this tension in your philanthropy?
Thank you, Maria, and thank you for that amazing introduction of our guests. Well, I'd like to begin with an example. At One Earth Future about 10 years ago, we started working with the UN Contact Group on global piracy. And so with the UN, I interviewed young pirates in Somali prisons. And when we interviewed them, we asked them for their advice. What can we do as a global organization to try to keep more young men from becoming pirates? And what they said, I'll never forget. They said that if you want other young men in Somalia not to follow us, you have to create hope and jobs for the locals. These young men were right. We went back and thought about it, and we discovered that, in fact, it's important to deliver on the ground solutions. It isn't enough to have a grand vision. There's obviously a tension when working on big problems. Solving a big problem requires solving all of the root causes, and to try to do so together, it's not easy. The program work that you select has to be narrow, and it also has to deliver measurable impact. Today, the idea of robust coordination among all sectors of society it's becoming mainstream, right? We believe now that government, civil society, international global organizations, and even business is at the table working cooperatively on many of these issues. For example, in piracy, the businesses showed up, and they were a very important supporter of the entire initiative. And it was when they put guards on boats that really helped. But they also went on the ground and did what we did to try to help the young men get jobs so that they had a future. So you have to balance the big issue like piracy with the idea of delivering local impact like jobs. You have to form the link, and then in our view, it's like building blocks. The local impact has to build, and it has to build into a systemic impact. One effort, in effect, nests into the next. So we believe that with the right building blocks and using the right architecture, you can build a global solution. But the solutions at the core, they need to be implemented locally by the stakeholders. So it isn't enough for the global community to complain about piracy. They have to get on the ground, find out what the root source is, and try to cure the problem at the root source. Those of us who have the resources and the vision, we're part of the solution. But frankly, we don't have the solution. We don't own the solution. So at the core, it's the locals in Somalia that really own the solution. Otherwise, the navies will be there forever, and we'll end up with a dysfunctional, dysfunctional solution. But if you get the architecture and the design right, we believe that local problem solving builds into a sustainable, peaceful world. Today, all of our programs have the same idea, that we go local. We don't just go global. There needs to be an alignment between the international donors, national governments, local actors in the developing world. Today, we have a great program in Somalia. It's called the Shirako program. Shirako means partner in Somali. And we partner with Norway, Denmark, the EU, and one of our sister foundations, the Arsenal Family Foundation. And what we do is help finance businesses. These businesses do solar, they do fishing, they raise chickens. There's women who have businesses making jewelry. There's all sorts of businesses that we finance. And these businesses, basically create jobs and an opportunity so that the violence in Somalia doesn't perpetuate. Similarly, in Colombia, we work with several universities. We work with the Colombian government, local governments, and several UN initiatives. We also embrace the idea of iterative problem solving. Unfortunately, when you get on the ground, you discover the world operates completely different than you thought it might, or perhaps than you thought it should. But when you get on the ground with a global question, you have to figure out how to add value and how that fits into the global question. And above all, I think you need to be patient and learn. I remember 10 years ago giving a talk at the UN at the Piracy Contact Group. And I remember saying that I had good news and bad news because it was right after the Great Recession. I said, the good news is it isn't going to cost much money to help solve the problem in Somalia. But the bad news is it's going to take a very long time. So we have to be patient and we have to help the Somalis rebuild their society. And that's the way you eliminate the problem. Frankly, when we started, we ran, what you might call a bank. We had some very, very good employees. They were all Somali. We got them from all over the world. But on a cost basis, we ran what I call the dumbest bank in the world. Our overhead was extremely high compared to our loan book. But we were patient and we knew that eventually we'd get enough loans out there and we'd get enough partners that it would start to balance. And today, 10 years later, I'm happy to report that our systems work very well. And indeed, they're getting better every year. So that's the local part of it. We're at Shirako, we're getting close to covering our overhead. So I think in summary, you start with a global problem, but you hold yourself accountable for short-term measurable results. So we have to understand that solutions aren't sustainable unless they're both globally sustainable and locally sustainable. And frankly, I have to admit that getting that formula right is not easy. So thank you, Maria.
Thank you so much. I totally relate, and it's super important. One key message which I've had is the locals own the solutions. In order to have sustainable development, the locals own solutions and do this alone. Which really is a good segue for the next question for you, Jens, is what role can philanthropists play in the management of the present global catastrophic risks?
Thank you, Maria. And yes, everything is local in one way, and inspired by Marcel, I think I should tell I'm sitting by another sea. It's the Baltic Sea. Around the Baltic Sea are several countries. It's a fantastic sea, but half or a fourth of it is actually dead because we cannot take decisions together on a common good. There is no accountability, there is no operationality really in decision making. And so you can take this local problem and lift them up to the global level that I'm going to talk about. And let me start with saying that I'm a Democrat, and I think when we spend public money, we should take democratic decisions. In a way, philanthropists have the privilege, I would say, to decide for herself or himself or with the foundation where to spend the resources. And our founder have decided that he would like to spend the resources on the new global catastrophic risks. I would say the new global catastrophic risks are climate changes, environmental catastrophes, weapons of mass destructions. And when the UN was rebuilt in 1945-46, these catastrophes were not on the scene. And so the UN, in a way, is not built to deal with this risk, I would say. And at the same time, in these 75 years, the interdependence between us here on Earth has grown tremendously. So meanwhile, interdependence have gone like this, our institutions are still here. And what we can see here is the risk gap. So what can philanthropists do? Well, he or she or the foundation can try to fill that gap, to see what do we need. We have a problem here. We have global catastrophic risks that are not properly dealt with. Do we have a vision? Yes, we have a vision to mitigate these risks. And do we have measures? Well, let's look for measures to how to deal with them. So what we did was we actually started out with research to see, do we have the knowledge that we need? We have every year handed out risk reports where the best researchers on different risks give their view on what is the status of these risks. We also wanted to look for new ideas. So we actually conducted a worldwide competition on new ideas for a better international global decision making. And when I'm now talking about decision making on a global level, perhaps many of you would think of a global government. That's not what we foresee. We global decision making. We foresee stronger legitimacy on a global level because that is actually the basis for also legality. We also foresee stronger international courts, but we don't see a government the way that we have in our nation state. Sometimes people are afraid when you talk about global decision making. They don't want to lose their possibility to affect decisions. But and I'm totally for that. We talk in Europe about the subsidiarian system, where all decisions should be taken as close to the people that are affected by them as possible. But at the same time, I would say that global or transnational decisions are often strengthening the freedom of the individual. The human rights are actually there for the individual, but it's taken on a global level. It's Same thing with can have freedom of speech or whatever. So from this phase of research and knowledge, spread knowledge, risk reports, having competitions, supporting the winners with different examples on how the decision making could be strengthened, we have seen that we need to go into partnerships. We need to work with others. Or as you said, Maria, we can only be human together. We have to build alliances. We have built alliances with some of them that are in these discussions. So that's where we are now, to build alliances, because I think that actually the way to also for a philanthropist is to be a catalyst. You cannot do it yourself. You need to build alliances, but you can start off by supporting research to see how the problem is, to fill the gaps where they are. And the aim of the foundation that I am working for is very much looking into lacks in the system, lacks in decision making. I mean, if we have a problem here around where I live, it will be taken up by the municipality. If it is a problem that deals with a lot of people, it will be taken up by the parliament. But if it's a global problem and it's a global catastrophic risk, there is not enough of, I would say, architecture for decision making. And that is the gap that we see. And that is where we would like to work for others, to have some sort of rule-based decision making where you can also ask for accountability. That is, I would say, a civil society, civilized society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jens. You know, even when you were talking, I was reminded of this African proverb: if you want to go fast, walk alone. If you want to go far and wide, you have to walk in partnerships. So very important for philanthropy to engage in partnerships. We cannot do this and resolve this global catastrophe alone, which is a very good question that I have for you, Sandra, is what are the conditions, both in terms of philanthropic sector and the overall environment for foundations to be able to participate and have an impact?
Thank you so much, Maria. And I will sort of build on what Jens and Marcel said before me. First of all, I think we have to acknowledge that we have come a long way. When we look at the multitude of state and non-state actors involved in global governance, philanthropic organizations and foundations specifically have definitely claimed their space in recent decades. And they can be and are very influential also because private wealth has increased significantly in the past decades. But there is, on the one hand, not only what Jens said, sort of not enough space for decision-making and institutions for decision-making, but there is also a backlash concerning a more inclusive consultation and decision-making process. We've seen these after the SDG process. I think there has been a backlash against the involvement of non-state actors. And there is also, I would say, and this will maybe increase over the next months and hopefully not years, a broader societal backlash against wealth, against inequality, and against the influence of high-level net worth individuals. Or you just said that when you introduced us, look at the level of wealth. And I said, yes, hopefully it's the level of experience and knowledge and less the level of wealth in terms of money, because I think that creates backlash. And you know, it also then comes with a question of legitimacy. I know it's differently addressed in the US or in Europe or even within Europe between countries, but we have to raise that question. And you know, we're not talking, when we talk about philanthropy, about a monolith. We're talking about an extremely diverse sector, which is its strength. But let's be honest, it is difficult to understand from the outside what philanthropy does and what it means, we are quite introspective ourselves. We have to acknowledge that the sector itself is not per se on the good side of things. And we have to essentially build trust. We have the duty more now than before because we are looking at the big issues and we are, involved in political and policy processes. And because there is more wealth, we have the duty to be transparent, to explain what we do and why we do it. I think all of us would claim that we do that, but still, I think for the public, it's extremely relevant, and for decision makers too. We have to explain to whom we are accountable, and we ourselves need to be inclusive in how we work. And we all say that we are, but if we look at it, it's much easier to talk to those who have our and hold our opinions. I think we are, as Marcel and Jens said, in a unique position of being able to take a long-term approach, to take risks and to act with flexibility and independently. And that makes us absolutely unique because we can look at the really intelligent solutions and push those and scale those. But we should use that comparative advantage in a strategic way. We need to build consensus among ourselves, which is not always given either, and within our societies in order to increase our legitimacy and our joint leverage. We have to, as Jens just said, base our knowledge on our work on knowledge and what we do on knowledge and not on ideology or assumptions. We also need to focus on relevant issues in order to sit at the table if we want to talk about global governance issues. And then you have to tackle the big issues and the big problems. This means questioning whether what we do is relevant and how our legacies, which are uniquely individual, can be applied to contemporary issues. Having said all that, we have to be modest about our limitations, about the fact that asymmetries with regard to power and resources remain. And, we, as Marcel started, I think, have to say that we don't own the solutions. And that is very important. If we fulfill these conditions, I think the political environment will change. And actually, the political environment for international cooperation will be more receptive to what we do and how we engage, because we will act from a broader consensus and ultimately have more societal support. So, I always encourage us to be very modest, but it's also a very European or maybe even German discussion, because I know that American philanthropies would act differently. And that is the beauty of it, that we are different. But if we interact on global issues, I think we have to talk very openly about these limitations that we have. I mean, look just at the flow of money. If we talk about cross-border giving, philanthropy is at the lower end. The biggest part is remittances, by far the biggest part, even before development aid. And then philanthropies come after individual giving. So we should be modest about what we can achieve.
Thank you, Sandra. Very honest and good reflection of philanthropy. Like, who are we accountable to? And we also have to be very modest in how we engage when we are addressing these issues. Very common theme amongst all is the importance of listening to who we are accountable to. So for the next question, James, is Open Society Foundations is a global foundation that pursues philanthropy in different ways. How do you carry out this philanthropic mission to further global governance?
Thank you, Maria. And I wanted to just highlight how much I agree with so much of what's been said. Marcel focusing on the link between the local and the global, Jens underscoring that we cannot do this ourselves, we need partners. And Sandra underscoring that on the one hand, we in philanthropy need to acknowledge our shortcomings, and yet we still need to tackle very big problems. And global governance is a big problem. That is the challenges to global governance today. Global governance is an ideal that, of course, means different things to different people. And for us at Open Society, It is a vehicle for holding states accountable for their professed values, whether equal justice, free expression, democratic practice. Nearly 20 years ago, the Open Society Foundations recognized that we could amplify our philanthropic efforts to build inclusive and vibrant democracies by providing resources beyond direct grants. The foundation created an in-house legal laboratory that I currently lead, called the Open Society Justice Initiative. We use the law, which is so often an instrument of power, as a tool in the service of justice. We litigate in courts, we engage in legal advocacy with political leaders and other actors, and we work along those in affected communities to co-create change. In this model, individuals and communities who are marginalized by injustice are not just grantees, but they may be thought partners, co-counsel, advocates. I want to talk briefly about one of the archetypal institutions of global governments with which we're engaged, and that's the International Criminal Court. Until recently, the course of human history has been one of impunity for violence. The establishment of the International Criminal Court in 1998, for the first time, offered survivors of heinous crimes the possibility of legal accountability through prosecution of the perpetrators. Then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan proclaimed the court a gift of hope to future generations. And yet we have to recognize that despite the triumph of its creation, the way that the ICC has operated to date has failed to fulfill its founding ambition. A string of acquittals and dismissed charges and lengthy proceedings are among the problems that have provoked growing concern among many stakeholders. Almost 2 decades into its operation, the court has produced just a few convictions for core crimes that have survived appellate review, despite spending in excess of $150 million a year. In light of this record, it's fair to ask, is the ICC, an institution which was born at a fleeting moment of post-Cold War optimism, still worth fighting for? We believe it is. Notwithstanding its flaws, the ICC has shown that it can sometimes live up to the grand expectations that marked its birth. Last July, a former rebel commander from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, known as the Terminator, was convicted on 18 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And on a growing basis, the court's mere existence as a permanent institution that embodies global values has served as a catalyst for accountability at the national level. Just this April, prosecutors in Germany brought to trial 2 former high-ranking members of Syria's General Intelligence Directorate, who were accused of overseeing and perpetrating systematic torture, rape, and murder during the Assad regime's brutal civil war. There is much that can be done to make the ICC more effective. The court is currently in the process of electing its next chief prosecutor, and we've been deeply engaged with other partners from civil society and with some government allies to ensure that whoever is chosen has the skill and the experience to carry out the court's mandate with integrity and efficiency. But at the same time, philanthropists can also help the court confront an immediate challenge from Washington that could deliver a body blow to the historic struggle against impunity. It should not be surprising that an institution that was created to limit the power of political and military leaders would confront fierce headwinds. But this June, the Trump administration took an unprecedented step, issuing a sweeping executive order authorizing asset freezes against ICC officials and others who assist the court's investigations. And just this month, the current prosecutor herself was designated as subject to sanctions. We're working with a broad coalition of civil society and government actors across the globe to respond to these threats. The decline in respect for the rule of law that we are witnessing today reminds us that, flawed as it is, the International Criminal Court remains a capstone for our centuries-long search for a world in which the law prevails over force. And we believe that Open Society's unusual mix of tools, from grant making to advocacy to in-house litigation, can provide an important contribution toward that goal. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing the work of the Open Society and also highlighting the successes and also the challenges that the International Criminal Court has faced, which also reminds me, like the moment we're in, I live in US, and it's super important for us to recognize that there is no peace without justice. So it's important for us to highlight some of these challenges around the justice and how we could be able to have peace. So I'd like to ask a question from my audience. Please feel free within the chat section, just ask your questions. I will be able to get them and share them with our amazing panelists. So this next segue for the round two, especially with Jim highlighting the institutions, I think it's important this round will be a discussion on how UN 75 anniversary can serve as a catalyst for the United Nations, sparking systemic change and advancing multilateral and multi-stakeholder partnerships. Marcel, I would like to ask you again around this, like how can multi-stakeholder partnerships, such as developed by the OEF in this forum, increase your impact and success?
Thank you, Maria. Well, as the other panelists, Sandra, Jens, James have alluded to, philanthropy is a very small player. And we embrace the idea that no single organization can manage the complexity of our modern multipolar world. As you were saying, Jens, there's an architectural gap. We call it the missing architecture of global governance. We're all collectively trying to put pieces in place. But it isn't just, it's very, very difficult to do because all of these problems are enormously complex. We do a lot of research. We have a research department, and we find that many of them are actually contributors one to the other. So you end up with this network of problems that creates a large meta problem. And you have to go down to the roots, but all of the roots are individual, and many of them contribute in very complex ways. So it's not really easy at all to figure out how to go forward. It's very much, we call it a Braille process of figuring out what the governance should be. But, we all have to admit there's a modern multipolar world. Sandra, as you were saying, even the question of wealth is on the table. There's so many questions that are very, very complex that we have to sort out. The other thing that we're cognizant of, and this relates to what you were saying, Sandra, is we're a small foundation relative to the big foundations. No one, not even the Gates Foundation, has enough money to solve these problems. Even the most wealthy in the world, their wealth would not probably solve any of these problems alone, certainly not without the cooperation and the engagement and the legitimacy of others. So we're bimodal in this. We work on very specific problems, as you do, Jim, and your foundation. What are you going to pick? What are you going to try to contribute to? So you got to add value. We use the expression utility matters. The world will figure it out. I love the quote from Churchill. He said that we can trust the Americans to do the right thing, but only after they've done everything else. Well, we're somewhere on the everything else list, to be honest, working our way to the right thing. And it's not just the Americans, we all do it as humans. These are enormously complex problems. And so we know that we have to engage multi-stakeholders. So on one hand, we want to focus and make a real contribution. And on the other hand, we have to engage stakeholders, and it ain't easy. We're not even sure who to talk to. We have one in our values, we talk about engaged stakeholders. They really own it. We regard as philanthropists, we call ourselves catalysts. And if those of you who know, biochemical or chemical reactions, understand the catalyst isn't very important. It just helps the substrates change. So we regard our role as somewhat catalytic. But when you talk about multi-stakeholder partnerships, each sector of society should focus basically on what they do well, so that we don't get into each other's lanes. For example, the private sector, we think it's a very important contributor to the future of the world. It'll either be a good contributor or a bad contributor, and probably both. and you need to work with them. You understand what they can bring to the table, both positive and negative, and they're at the table whether we like it or not. Clearly, in a good world, they provide economic sustainability, and they provide the economic power and the efficiency to solve the problems. So we think business needs to be at the table. And just as an example, as we sit here today, we're all aware that there are biotech companies that are private enterprises all over the world working, and we're in touch with some of them, working day and night to try to bring a series of COVID vaccines. So there's a very positive contribution. And in Somalia, we work with a lot of alternative energy companies that are out there installing solar, wind, and battery power so that these small villages can be connected to the real world, and young girls and boys can read in the evening and learn because they have light. So civil society, in our view, provides the initiatives that work at a local level. And again, it's not our ideas. We have to contribute clearly, but as a catalyst, it's the substrates that matter. So we regard ourselves as people that are obligated to bring proof of concept. You know, we have to show that something works, and after we show that it works, we're very hopeful that governments will wake up and say, gee, this now works, and it will help us scale the resources. And we find that that's indeed the truth, that if you have something that works, others will follow. That's the reason we all have cell phones. They work. Utility matters. So if you can trust humans to do something, they'll follow their utility. And so our job is to, as philanthropists, is to get out there and prove that something that's complex can be made better and better, just as Open Society is doing with the ICC. Obviously it ain't working well, but what the heck, new things usually don't work well for a long time. It takes a lot of patience, and it takes a lot of advocacy to get it on the right track and get it efficient. So, we feel that we're much too small to have a major impact on our own. We call ourselves venture capital philanthropists. We get out there and do things, with for example, the revolutionaries, the retiring revolutionaries in Colombia, get them jobs. That's what they want. They want to come back into society. And if you don't bring them back in, guess what? You're going to have a lot of people with arms that know how to shoot. And that's not really what you want. So you need to work with a lot of partners, and indeed we do. Another example of partnership that we've done is collaboration on secure fisheries. Again, that's an organization that we mounted an initiative in Somalia. They're working with the Global Cold Chain Alliance and the governments of Somalia, several of them, as we all know. There's competing governments in Somalia, and we work with them all. And they're trying to catalyze the development of refrigerated supply chains so that Somalia's important fishing sector, they're one of the best fishing sectors in the world. Some people believe that's why piracy started, because, a whole bunch of countries came in and started stealing the fish from Somali waters. The Somalis got angry and took over some of the boats, and that became a business model called piracy. But anyway, our initiative, Secure Fisheries, has spent 3 years developing the cooperative management principles around Somali fisheries. So on the ground, we have a number of locals, and we work with stakeholders to build trust networks for the local fisher people, the government, and the donors. This creates an efficiency that now the private sector can come in, because from relative chaos is sort of an organized supply chain. And so, buyers can come in and bring the product to Ethiopia, thus creating jobs in Somalia and allowing them to take control of their own destiny and their own resources. So our view is, of course, if you can solve these problems at a local level, they're going to cascade or build up into rational architecture. And by the way, we think they own the architecture. It ain't ours, it's theirs. We wouldn't want them coming to America telling us how to do things. It's a very interesting thought. I don't know why philanthropists are stuck with this idea and believe that the idea translates down to somebody who lives in an entirely different world. By the way, it was one of those. I was disavowed of it. I learned when I got on the ground, there was an entirely different reality. And by the way, it's really quite beautiful. The reality that they have is different than the one I grew up in Northern Canada, but it's equally relevant, and it works very well if you understand their rules. So you just capture their rules, you honor what they do. All of our loans are done, they're Sharia compliant, it's a Muslim country. We have no problem with that. But people all over the world will honor each other if you do the right thing. But I think in the end, partnership needs to be inclusive. And if I had any advice to the people here, most of us come from civil society. But I would advise that we keep an eye on business, and not just the negative part of business, but the positive part. Business doesn't know where the hell the world's going. I can promise you that. They don't know. They don't have a clue. They're worried, they're engaged. And I think for the most part, business is run by decent people that want to do the right thing. It's not a big part of their mandate, number one, and nobody's talked to them about exactly how to do it. But I think they're extraordinary partners if you can capture them. So that'd be my concluding thought. Don't forget business. They deserve to be at the table with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcel. You have really described exactly how partnership should look like when we are engaging in this very complex challenges. And even I like how you mentioned the resources and how we can have to be very strategic, how you need to ensure that you're working with the locals, and how you can ensure with the limited resources philanthropy has, who is on the ground, the businesses, and then also the duty of the government to enforce some of these so as to be able to scale the work that philanthropy is doing. Amazing. Thank you so much, Marcel.
Thank you.
So the next question for you, Jens, is how do you see philanthropy work towards society change and not just repeatedly filling the gaps of insufficiency?
That's a good question. I'm lucky that I'm very inspired by my fellow panelists here, Sandra, James, and Marcel. You already taught me a lot. Well, the societal change and how you can come up with that depends, of course, of your theory of change. I often worked with saying that you need to strengthen people's own possibility to change their society and thereby their own life. And one way of doing it is to join forces. Of course, you can also be a lobbyist or of a more top-down approach. But as far as we have seen when it comes to larger changes, not the least in the country where I live, is that it has been movements behind. It could be a civil rights movement, it could be a women's movement, it could be a green movement, a peace movement, or a labor movement. When, for instance, in Sweden, we had the right to work only 8 hours and rest hours, it was with a threat of a general strike. And it was also a connection over the borders to other countries. So I really see the need of movements. I think it was really interesting when you said, Sandra, that we don't own the solution. And that's very right. And that also must make us humble, I think. Although I think we so far is the most interested panel. That's not humble, but I just said it. But, so what we need is to connect, I think, or to be a catalyst, as Marcel, with other movements. And I'm, of course, thinking about also Fridays for Future with Greta from Sweden, who is now also I think in an interesting way, not only formulating that something has to be done, but also talking a little bit of what James took up, that we need perhaps also a rule of law. We need to look at the ICC and also talk about not only genocide, but ecocide. And if the Fridays for Future want to use the the Children Convention, the right to life, they also have a legal instrument. So what we are still lacking to make a societal change is a rule-based society, a rule-based global society. And here I think the philanthropists could not be a movement, but they can finance research, we can share knowledge, we can spread statistics. I know myself being a politician, I think what I listened to was if there were many people, if there was a movement, the movement could make me lose my legitimacy, but also if they brought statistics that could see what was happening and what we can do, then I think philanthropists could also be part of societal changes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I like it. Philanthropy should be part of society change. Very, very necessary in these strange times. As you all know, we're all virtual because we're in this pandemic, and the important role that philanthropists play. So Sandra, what have we learned from UN 75 anniversary in terms of process, results, framework, especially in the light of COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I mean, we are not through the year yet, and we'll see. But I like Jens' picture of the fact that we need a rule-based global society. And it's interesting as we talk, and I listened to James, and when I was preparing and thinking a bit about it, also as we were engaging as a foundation in UN at 75. We do have institutions. James mentioned ICC. We do have the United Nations. We do have something called multilateralism, and yet we hardly ever mention the names because all of this is so loaded politically and so negatively loaded. And that actually, I think, is one of the big problems. The anniversary essentially of the United Nations, I would say, was overtaken by events. I think the British Foreign Ministry has even a stand where it says, on papers, that something was overtaken by events. And I don't think that this is necessarily for the negative. It heightened the contradictions we have been seeing before. Politically, I think in the world, we're in an absolutely national moment. Whereas, in terms of the challenges and the issues, we're in an absolutely global moment. And I think that is sort of the basis that we come from. And for many people, they understand that they're in a global moment. They see that what is happening to them is happening to many, even though in a different manner and with different consequences, but they don't actually see much support from outside. And, the pandemic has shown that we need the global solidarity and cooperation that we were aiming for. There is, I think, very much renewed recognition of the need for multilateral cooperation on issues affecting us all. But there is also a lack of faith in the institutions which are not equipped to deal with such crises and weakened by the lack of political will and actually by political bickering. So post-crisis, we all know we need a crisis-resistant and agile, a responsive institution to manage and institutions to manage consequences of such global crises and these upcoming more and more interconnected global challenges. I sometimes think that we could benefit from more pragmatic approaches. I think many of these institutions that we have are difficult to even mention and to work on because they're so loaded ideologically. If we took a more pragmatic approach, sometimes it would be good. I think one of the processes we've had in the past, in particular the SDG implementation, show that all of the sectors can contribute with critical assets, whether it's the expertise of civil society organizations, the unique position that they are placed to represent citizens worldwide, of course, the legitimacy and the scale of governments, but also, of course, as was said, the efficiency and the interest of the private sector and of business, which is hugely important in this endeavor. There remains a lot of room for improvement, for instance, regarding the independent monitoring and evaluation of multi-stakeholder initiatives, or when it comes to a shared definition of the problem, I think, which is mostly the biggest problem in line with the existing international legal and institutional frameworks. But I think that it's very promising to return to UN at 75 and the anniversary that we are celebrating. And I hope we are celebrating. Sometimes I even think that people don't want to mention that there is an anniversary, which is really a reason to celebrate if we remind ourselves why it was created. That the political declaration to be adopted by the UN General Assembly next week will commit UN member states to boost partnerships with actors across whole of society. I think that is very encouraging. And I also found that the fact that the United Nations Secretary General in January 2020 started the biggest ever global conversation, as it was called, was very encouraging. And I personally am encouraged by the results of that conversation. It was a different conversation than initially planned. It was planned with a lot of, in-person consultations worldwide. Most of that then turned over to the digital world. But there is momentum. There is momentum sometimes because of and sometimes despite the crisis. And we have to use both. We see a broad popular consensus in favor of international cooperation because I simply believe that people see the need. All people worldwide have been able to assess the performance of their own governments as compared to others in this pandemic. And I think this is actually the first time in our history that we've had that moment. And even though governments have been very different, and you can't necessarily say that democracies have fared better than autocracies, but there is a moment of comparison, and there is a moment of people seeing individual governments are not able to solve this. So even though there is a lack of faith, there is a belief that it's necessary, this international cooperation. And actually there is a belief, with all of the criticism involved, that the United Nations have to play a pivotal role. And that is encouraging and positive, and we should use that. And I'm saying this coming from a sector which probably has had a lot of frustrations working with the multilateral institutions worldwide. This global conversation, during which individuals and stakeholder groups shared hopes and fears on the future we want and the future we need, generated a wealth of data on the immediate and long-term concerns of people worldwide, and how the United Nations should tackle these concerns, and actually how national governments should respond. And the final results of the combined data streams will be presented next week, but it will be our job also as foundations and civil society to look into the data that has been assembled and to work with that. Because what will be presented next week will be sort of a summary of it all, but it's actually worth looking into that wealth of data. It should be sort of an empirical resource that we work with. We should use that, and we should expand on it because it's global. It has a lot of voices from the global south in it. It has a lot of voices from those countries that we work with and in. And if we don't do that, all of these hundreds of thousands of people who responded and who were engaged and optimistic about the change will be disappointed, and the window of opportunity will have been lost. But I think it's really important to see that with all of the caveat involved, people see that individual governments cannot do it. They see the necessity, and they also believe that there is nothing else on the horizon but the United Nations for now. I'm interested to see how, for example, in our media coverage, the United Nations anniversary will be celebrated, and if at all. It's all obviously sort of behind sort of the COVID pandemic, which is dominating the discourse. But we as foundations have a responsibility to point to that anniversary and to use it.
Thank you so much, Sandra. You really raised very valid points and super important, because I always look at celebrations as a time of reflection. And what better time is it to reflect when we're in the middle of a pandemic on how we want to show up, how we want to be different. Thank you so much. Very timely and important. And most important, the importance of global solidarity, because we cannot do this alone. So the next question is for you, James, is how can philanthropists use the example and promise of the UN to foster enhanced partnerships in the service of the UN founding ambitions?
Thank you, Maria. I'd like to pick up on this discussion to talk about the importance of access to justice as an example of a successful partnership among organized civil society, social movements, the United Nations, and philanthropy. Sandra mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'd like to touch on SDG 16, which we and others call the Justice Goal. Well before the SDGs were negotiated, a number of visionary activists, and our founder, George Soros, was one of them, had the foresight really to recognize that development measures needed to shift away from an unduly narrow conception of poverty eradication. To combat poverty, governments needed to widen their lens to address problems of justice, whether the threat of eviction, limited access to social benefits, the lack of identity documents, all of which disproportionately affect the poor and marginalized. And as a global philanthropy, we worked closely with governments and civil society at every level to raise awareness of the importance of access to justice, not as an airy principle, but in the reality of daily life. This campaign lifted up the voices of partner communities in national capitals and in the halls of the United Nations. And this global partnership helped secure the inclusion of Goal 16 in the SDGs, and specifically Target 16.3, which calls upon states to ensure equal access to justice for all as an essential component of a new development agenda. Important as that achievement was, it was only one step, of course, in a longer struggle. Since the goal was adopted, a worldwide coalition of foundations and national governments and local and national NGOs, together with the UN global architecture, have worked to give practical meaning to that broad promise of access to justice. We were delighted that in March of this year, the UN Statistical Commission created an SDG indicator to track progress towards civil justice and endorsed recommendations for strengthening data that can be used to monitor and expand access to justice over time. We've seen in Ukraine, where we've worked with local NGOs and the International Renaissance Foundation, how progress can be made toward a nationwide legal aid regime. As a result, Ukraine has gone farther than many in requiring that when somebody is placed under arrest, the police must notify a legal aid center so that a lawyer can be provided immediately. In South Africa, we've worked closely with local NGOs and other philanthropies and government to strengthen a nationwide network of community advice offices, which provide essential services to vulnerable individuals and communities across the country. And in Indonesia, we've worked with government officials, civil society, and the organized bar, the private bar, to develop an online legal smart channel to help people locate legal services and put in place an accreditation process for community-based legal aid organizations. These are just a few examples of what is possible and what needs to happen everywhere. To work at the global level and often through processes shepherded by the United Nations is necessary. But as Marcel and Jens and Sandra have all noted, it's not sufficient. Change requires partnerships from the ground up to enable national level organizing, legislation, institutional creation, and movement building. And I think philanthropies will have to become ever more agile if we are going to deliver on the elusive promise of justice for all. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you so much. I'm also just reminded within the peace building community, they call Goal 16 the peace goal. So the two are very much linked. So for our round three, I know the audience, we have so many questions coming, but we are going to get you, but at least let us just have this last round to have this, allow our panelists, just give us, as we move into the landscape changed by the pandemic, what do you see the best path forward for philanthropy and global governance? Which issues or geographies resonate most areas where we need to focus on our joint energy and create outside systemic change? What might the obstacles or bright spots be? And also just share with us an example from today and beyond UN 75 to the future we want and the UN we need. So Marcel, I'll kick it off to you.
Oh, thank you. I'll try to be brief so that we can get some good questions. Thank you, Maria. Well, I think as we're suggesting here, the world needs to confront the reality that we're facing. Many new challenges that humanity has not seen, except in the last 75 years: nuclear weapons, climate change, and recently COVID-19. The problem is, in reality, as you were saying, Jens, there's no one in charge. I like to say 7 billion people, no plan. That's the situation. The nation state works pretty well. As you try to coordinate the silos, you end up not with complexity. Well, you do get complexity, by the way, but you also get dysfunction. And we're working our way through that. As some of us have alluded, we all share the same language, it appears. We call that the missing global architecture, and it needs to be built. Nobody owns it. It has to be built collectively, and it has to have legitimacy. At the end of the day, no one is empowered. But I believe, as some of us are saying, that had we had a great system in place, COVID-19 could have been stopped in its tracks. We did not. A number of philanthropists called this out. Our own shop did about 10 years ago. We abandoned the effort because there was very little interest from multilateral institutions, from nations, from anything. And we just felt that it was lonely work, and humanity was condemned to experience the problem first and then perhaps wake up. So that was our conclusion. And in the end, I think we'll get this fixed, by the way. But the thing that's really sad is that we could have had it fixed if we had great global systems in place that anticipated it and had plans in place and resources, properly resourced it. So perhaps, as you're saying, Sandra, perhaps we can derive lessons from this. I'm afraid the lessons could go either way. The heck with everybody else, there's a fair amount of that going on. We're going to do it alone. Or the other one is, oh my goodness, it looks like this little virus has no favorites. Their favorite is a human body. That's what their favorite is. And they'll go anywhere. That's pretty clear. So I think one of the things that we certainly can't solve these problems as philanthropists, but I think we can bring the questions to the table. We can challenge the nation states, which I think we can do and should do. What are you not doing? Why are you not collectivizing? Why are you not coming up with solutions? And philanthropy has one thing that we've noticed. It has the ability to look at problems from the perspective of the problem. As you were saying, Jens, when you're a politician, you're not allowed to look at the problem. You have to look at the problem from the nation state standpoint. It's their money, that's how you're looking at it. The problem is the virus doesn't respect borders. So, you no longer can look at the problem from a nation state standpoint and be done. Obviously, you got to fill in that global architecture. Who's going to be responsible for it? Where do we get the resources? How do we get ahead of this so that we're not condemned to suffer the consequences again and again? I think we'll get it right. But the architecture that we do have is clearly at this point somewhat unreliable. We all agree. James, your comment on the ICC makes that point very well. But it doesn't absolve us of the obligation of trying to create this architecture, do it experimentally, do it collectively. It'll be an ugly process, but I'm reminded that democracy was an ugly process that took hundreds and hundreds of years. So with the UN, we need to be patient. We need to understand that humanity is going through a transition. Our job is to help visualize and help lead and to challenge our stakeholders. If a critical mass of global philanthropists can align behind certain principles, I think we can, as we say, we can fight above our weight. We can have a little bit more of an impact. So I think global governance will have to evolve and iterate its way forward along with the rest of humanity. But in closing, I'd say the UN was formed around a wonderful vision of a peaceful, prosperous world where the nations come together and govern collectively. Clearly, the work is incomplete, and clearly the nations have not are not perhaps in the alliance we would like them to be in that goal. But by the 100th anniversary, another 25 years, I hope we will find a more peaceful, prosperous, and integrated world. And as philanthropists, I think we all enjoy the privilege to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sandra?
You know, as we look into this landscape that we are now facing, I think it's still early to say how it has changed and how irreversibly. I think on that we will have to wait for some time to see. You know, all philanthropic organizations usually have very strong legacies. Some have living donors, some, you know, have legacies set in stone, and they are hugely individual. So it's difficult to say what the recipe for each organization is to do their best. But I think it's, first of all, crucial as we see the consequences of the pandemic and of the economic and social, you know, socioeconomic fallout, to balance immediate crisis response, because we will be involved in crisis response too. We cannot all pretend that we will be now dealing with the long-term issues only. I think in particular, nationally and locally, we'll be involved in immediate crisis response in different measure. And then the midterm and long-term integrated and inclusive change processes. And balancing that, I think, is quite difficult because many immediate things come up. You know, we felt that we needed to realign our strategy completely 3 years ago, because we thought that everything that we did based on the legacy might have been good, but whether it was relevant was a very different question. So we went from, in a 3-year process, from 34 topics in 5 focus areas to 10 topics in 3 focus areas. We ended some of the things that we had been doing for 38 years. And that is, for an organization which is 55 years old, quite, I would say, daring. But we felt we needed to do it in order to remain relevant and to question, you know, how you actually implement your legacy in a contemporary manner is very important. Because if you look at what we're doing today, I think our founder, Robert Bosch, would have said that this is the right interpretation for today. So we felt that, you know, among the transnational challenges requiring outsized systemic change, as you mentioned it, we felt that the following 6 areas were important. First is climate change, democracy, immigration society, which has a much more domestic component in Germany, inequality, migration, and peace. And why our, you know, the reason why our board felt these were relevant was actually not only the individual components and their respective challenges, but the nexus between those. And I think that's what Marcel said too. We have to look at integrated solutions, and we have to look where the nexus, all of this is connected, obviously, but where actually, you know, working on a nexus allows us to have more impact. We emphasize that nexus. You know, we also feel that that nexus and the quest for the nexus leads us into the right regions. And that we also have to act as a European foundation, looking at actually where the immediate responsibility might be. If we, you know, cannot bring peace to our immediate neighborhood, it's very difficult to argue and go and bring peace somewhere else. So I think, you know, to look at the credibility of where you come from and what your legacy is extremely important. I think that's sort of the way forward, at least for us, because it's difficult to give general recipes. I also feel that, you know, wherever we can, we need to engage with others. And we've seen this with climate change. On the climate change issue, for example, we are absolutely new to the table since the beginning of this year. And the open welcome we have seen by the alliances, the philanthropic alliances on this issue has been overwhelming. And not in the sense of, well, add your money to what we do, but how can we help you do the right thing according to your legacy? And this kind of solidarity in the philanthropic sector and respect for each other, even though we are much smaller than some of the, in particular, American foundations, has been crucial and very important to us. So I think this kind of solidarity and support for each other is extremely important in order to be complementary, as my my colleagues here on the panel said. I also feel that, you know, the kind of exchanges we have had in the past are maybe overcome. They have to be much broader and much more results oriented. And that goes for the philanthropic sector and the cross sectors. And we there cannot be any sector or any voice that we can not leave or leave unheard. We need to engage with all opinions, and that is extremely important. And then, we need to look at actually how strongly we can go ahead in our advocacy measures, because obviously influencing policy, and some of us do this more strongly, some of us don't. But in our advocacy measures, I think it's going to be relevant to take the best practices that we have, the experiences from these best practices, and to transport them into what to those who are responsible for policy, which we are at least not made for and created for.
Thank you so much. So Jens?
Maria, can you rephrase the question again?
So what might the obstacles or bright spots be? Please give us an example to bring us from today and beyond UN 75, the future we want and the UN we need.
Okay, thank you. I will be short and brief. I would say that I think we all can agree on that perhaps the most or worst threat to security for humanity is climate changes. Perhaps also a biological collapse. We are now following the mass extinction of our colleagues on Earth here. And meanwhile, these major security risks are developing. We have a Security Council in the United Nations that is not dealing with climate or environment. And I think that is a catastrophe itself. So if they don't deal with it, somebody else has to deal with it. And one example I think that we need to strengthen and we need to do that when it's threatened, and that is the ICC and the ICJ. And I started off talking about the Baltic Sea here. I think if a country would see that or have knowledge about that it is Sweden who is polluting the Baltic Sea, they should be able to bring us to the International Court of Justice, where you can hand out disputes between countries. Or if somebody else saw that a company or a country is having a severe impact on the Baltic Sea, they should be able to bring it to the ICC. So what I hope for, and it's uphill, is to have some sort of rule-based global society in the near future. If we cannot find that, I think we need to have clubs for like-minded. If there is a club that want to have, for instance, a carbon tax, we would like to be in that club. And if you're not in that club, you have to pay a higher charge if we are importing goods that are not having this carbon tax. So I think we should not abandon the UN or the systems we have. We should reform them. But maybe at the same time, we also have to create clubs for like-minded. Thank you.
Yes, we should not abandon the UN, but we should back to reform it. Good one. James?
Yes, thank you. And I'd like to touch on your question of where we should focus our energy. And given what is happening in the world today, I'd suggest that the UN and philanthropic organizations have both an opportunity and a responsibility to join forces to combat racial injustice in all its forms. In July, the Open Society Foundations announced the investment of $220 million in efforts to build power in Black communities and organizations and to promote new anti-racist policies in the United States. We're providing multi-year general support grants that allow for the sustainability of organizations who understand that this is a moment not just of incrementalism, but of whole-scale reform. And we know that lasting change takes time, as my colleagues on the panel have suggested. This set of investments in the form of 5-year grants is designed to allow Black-led groups the space to dream big and to act boldly and to plan for the long term. We need to ensure that racial justice is seen not as a fleeting cause, but as an enduring fault line that underlies so much about our contemporary society. Now, police violence against Black men and women is a focus of attention here in the United States, as it should be. But the burst of energy and outrage that have emerged around the world in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd reminds us that racial injustice is a global phenomenon that cuts across many spheres of life. And I just want to touch on two really briefly. One, the impact of race on access to citizenship. And secondly, the confluence of racism and economic injustice in new digital identification systems. We have recognized from the beginning of our organization the vital importance of citizenship in making effective the promise of fundamental human rights. Citizenship is, after all, a legal status that serves in practice as a precondition to the enjoyment of many other rights, whether voting, the right to own property, healthcare, or travel. Hannah Arendt famously termed citizenship the right to have rights. In recent years, we've witnessed worsening mistreatment of non-citizens, whether migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, or stateless persons. Citizenship has been politically manipulated and arbitrarily denied. In the United States, deprivation of nationality used to be reserved for the worst of the worst, serving as a proxy for direct accountability for war criminals or others who committed heinous crimes. But today, it's increasingly a radical political weapon that's increasingly deployed to deprive legally naturalized Americans of their citizenship. Around the world, citizenship denial and citizenship stripping on grounds of race are all too widespread. We've seen that in the Dominican Republic, where thousands of persons of Haitian descent are effectively stateless, even though many have been in the country for generations. We've seen in Myanmar, where the Rohingya have been denied access to nationality for decades, leaving them vulnerable to ethnic cleansing. In the face of these measures, many are fighting back. We've joined with partners to bring cases in a range of courts to challenge discriminatory citizenship denial. And earlier this year, a coalition of groups promulgated a set of principles on deprivation of nationality as a national security measure, which clarify the legal obligations under international law that states must comply with. We believe the UN could do more to disseminate these principles and encourage national governments to adopt them. And one final point, another field where racial discrimination can poison public policy is in the field of digital identification. Now, in principle, digital identification is a public good, but all too often it is rolled out in ways that disadvantage the already marginalized. The privacy concerns of digital ID are well known, but less attention has been given to how digital systems can accentuate and worsen discriminatory practices. We saw that in Kenya, where the president a year ago signed into law a sweeping new digital ID system. To be registered requires proof of identity. But the problem is that by making access to public benefits and services dependent on getting a digital ID, the new system heightens the costs for those who already face discrimination in getting the necessary documents. No proof of identity means no digital ID, which means you can't go to school, you can't get health care, you may not even be able to get electricity in your home. Digital ID schemes are being considered and adopted by governments across the globe without tailoring in ways that guarantee access for all. This is another area where civil society, philanthropy, business, and the UN can join forces. We know from history the lethal consequences of allowing xenophobic and racist policies to go unchallenged. And as we think beyond the UN 75 to the future we want, I urge all of us to do more to recognize and address the continued impact of racial injustice in every sphere in which we work. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you so much. You highlight very important issues, and I feel like it's a good segue, especially where we are as a pandemic, which has really exposed the inequalities against Black and Brown communities, the injustices against the marginalized. So thank you. And this is something that I feel like the UN should be able to contribute. So to our audience, we have not forgotten about you. We have a couple of questions for you, the panelists. So this first question for you, Marcel, from the audience is, what can either the UN or philanthropists do to improve effective partnerships between global philanthropy and UN goals and programs?
I'm sorry, was that directed to me, Maria?
Yes, please.
Oh, yes. Well, I think learn to work together. The UN agencies are relatively complex. I think it would be good if the UN agency sort of had a small partner program to work with local NGOs, and perhaps suspended some of the rules that were made. In large organizations, it's necessary to have a lot of rules, but the way you can get around that is by having local ombudsmen. So in the US, they have an organization called the Small Business Association, and it's a semi-government agency, but it does a very effective job of reaching out to small businesses. So that's one of the things I think the UN should consider, because it's a very large organization, a very complex organization. And I think they need to also go down to the people to reach down. So that'd be one thing I'd recommend. And as philanthropists, obviously, as Sandra was saying, we need to pick what we're going to work on. There's so much need out there on all of these issues that, you need to forgive the philanthropists if they decide to be focused, because that's the way they can have impact. So I think the public being a little, if you will, a little understanding of the fact that philanthropists are going to try to specialize and are going to try to work where they can add value. I think that'll be very helpful. And try to find a philanthropist that is on the same page as you, that really believes what you believe, because that's the beginning of all partnerships, right? Is a congruence of philosophy. And then at that point in time, I believe that you need to add value, whoever you are. Just because you have money doesn't absolve you. In fact, it's probably, frankly, a little bit of a curse when you think about it, because now you have an enormous responsibility that others are free of, because you got all this money you're supposed to do the right thing with. So I think finding philanthropy that thinks the way you do a little bit of searching, partner with them, and by all means add value. Try to figure out how you can go from A to B and prove on a small basis that what you're doing works, so that you can attract intelligent people, you can attract capital. That'd be my recommendation.
Thank you so much, Marcel. The other question from the audience for you, Jens, is considering the impact of COVID-19 is having on the condition of women worldwide, what role can philanthropy play in increasing gender equality worldwide at the global and local level?
Well, I think we often say when we are in politics that politics takes a lot of time. It's like a battleship, but once you have steered in another direction, it will be steady. The COVID-19 has seen that government can really also work in a very effective and in a very quick way. And I also work with other philanthropies, and one thing that I work with is gender-based violence and domestic violence. And we can see now in the effect of COVID-19 that we have an increase in domestic violence, for instance. And hereby we really have to, and that should also be rule-based. We have to have rules saying that in every municipality you live in, there has to be a shelter for women or protection for women that is a victim of gender-based violence. So that is one example that we can do. And we also have to have a lot of research when it comes to the effect of COVID-19. And that's what I talked about yesterday, that philanthropists, we can make, or we can support research, knowledge, to have statistics. What is the effects on women? What are the effects on children that we heard in the opening session? So here, I think also the philanthropists can fill a gap. The question that Marcel also talked about, how we can work together with the UN, I also just want to raise a difficulty or a problem that I see, and that is we have supported, for instance, this dialogue campaign that the UN is having. We wouldn't like to do that. We would like the UN to have that resources by itself. So meanwhile, we are also supporting gaps that we can see. We really have to work with a system where UN have the resources themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Sandra, in the theme of celebrating UN 75, where you mentioned, a question for you is, while we celebrate this, is it time to support experiments and evaluations of democratic mechanisms, representative or direct, at the global level?
Well, I think one of the big challenges ahead is actually, the question of how we will solve the existing big issues with different societal orders in place. And we have seen that sort of the order that we've had before has been challenged from many sides. And I think that what is hugely relevant is that democracies actually ask themselves what they need to do to have a strong contribution to any global process, and how they need to strengthen their own systems in order to support it and protect it. That is definitely a huge issue. I think if we now start looking at, the democratic deficit of, and it depends on which direction you go into, but the democratic deficits, it might take us for a very long time. And we've heard that some issues like climate change actually don't give us that time and don't allow us the time. So I think it's going to be a small or a process of incremental change. And, we have to know what we stand for, and, what kind of order we stand for, and what kind of processes we stand for. But the process has to be inclusive. That is hugely important. The process has to be extremely broad, and it has to be fair and transparent. Whatever process you have to come to a joint decision will have to be that way. Now, whether it's going to uphold to democratic standards is a different issue. And I think, to be very blunt, I think that's not realistic in many ways. Mm-hmm. I wish I could say something different.
No. Thank you. That's okay. So James, this is for you. Truman called at the closing ceremony of the UN Charter for an International Bill of Rights enforceable in courts. Do you support an international Bill of Rights and expanding regional courts to implement it?
Thanks, Maria, and thank you for the question. And we do have an international Bill of Rights. We have the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. What we don't have is the adequate means to actually ensure that those statements and provisions are applied in practice. And that's a process that is an ongoing one. Part of it, as the questioner suggests, is through the fortification of the regional human rights tribunals. We have them in Europe and in Africa and in the Americas, as well as the United Nations human rights machinery and the treaty bodies, etc., all of which are there, all of which are relatively weak, all of which need more political and economic resourcing. But in addition, it's about providing more resources and more support for communities at the local level to use these mechanisms for their own benefit, to be agents and have the capacity to make use of these norms to advance their own interests. And I think that's a project for which the UN in its next 75 years should commit itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have gone 4 minutes ahead. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, the panelists, for this amazing conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you to the audience for the questions. Thank you so much. And I hope, as Marcel says, after 25 years, when we have this discussion, we will have a different agenda and a different way of thinking and a better world and a better UN. Have a good day where you're all calling in from. I'm calling in from Baltimore, the greatest city in the United States of America. Wishing you all a lovely day, evening. Bye.
Thank you.
UN.
Thank you from Stockholm. Very nice to meet you here.
Mhm.
Looking forward to seeing you again.
Bye-bye.